Greetings, esteemed enthusiasts of maritime history and shipbuilding. Today, we will delve into the world of naval fleets to take a closer look at one of the most interesting cruisers, the USS Indianapolis. This heavy cruiser, to a certain extent, occupies an intermediate position between such renowned ships as the USS Pensacola and the USS New Orleans. The choice of this particular cruiser has garnered special attention, likely explained by its tragic yet significant history. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis, after all, became the largest single loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy. Furthermore, this ship played a crucial role in delivering components of the atomic bomb, which was later dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I will elaborate on all of this a little later, but for now, let us consider how this cruiser was designed in the first place. Following the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, strict limitations were placed on the construction of warships. Specifically, the displacement of cruisers was not to exceed 10,000 long tons, and the caliber of their main artillery was limited to 203 millimeters. To meet these requirements, a new type of ship was developed, the first of which was the USS Pensacola, ordered around 1926. A whole series of such cruisers was subsequently ordered based on the Pensacola type. Right after them, in 1927, the next type appeared, the Northampton. Both of these cruiser types were armed with 203mm guns, but to achieve high speed, they had extremely light armor. For instance, ships of the Pensacola type practically had no armor at all. After the Northampton type came the Portland type, to which the USS Indianapolis belongs. And following the Portland type was the New Orleans type. Thus, we have the sequence: Pensacola, then Northampton, followed by Portland, and finally New Orleans. So what exactly was the Portland type? Essentially, ships of the Portland type became a certain combination of features from the Pensacola and Northampton. American designers decided to stick with a traditional arrangement for their shipbuilding: 3 guns in 3 turrets, making a total of 9 barrels. 2 turrets were located forward and 1 aft. During the design process, it was discovered that the ship had a certain reserve of buoyancy, which allowed for the addition of extra armor. The fact was that both the Pensacola and Northampton proved to be underloaded, especially concerning armor. However, this did not solve issues with stability and top weight, as Americans often favored installing heavy equipment high above the waterline. Ultimately, the armor was significantly reinforced, but out of 8 cruisers initially ordered, only 2 were built according to the original design: the USS Portland itself and the USS Indianapolis. The remaining 6 ships were redesigned according to the New Orleans project, where they received even more armor and, of course, many other improvements. Both of these ships were armed with identical 203mm guns with a barrel length of 55 calibers. The secondary artillery was also constantly improved. By the end of the war, effective anti-aircraft guns such as Bofors and Oerlikon were installed on them. This usually included about 20 Oerlikon automatic cannons, as well as various Bofors mounts, for example 6 quadruple mounts. Additionally, 127mm dual-purpose guns were installed on the cruisers. Both of these ships served very intensively, as they say, meaning they spent a considerable amount of time at sea. They primarily operated as support forces during various amphibious operations. The cruiser Portland distinguished itself in many campaigns, survived the entire war, and was scrapped for metal only in 1959. The fate of the cruiser. Indianapolis, however, is a completely different story. It was truly a unique, even tragic fate. Before the war, long before its beginning, as the ship entered service on November 15, 1932, it served actively. This was almost 10 years before America entered World War II. During this time, the cruiser participated in many overseas voyages, visiting South America. President Roosevelt even traveled on board several times. It also took part in various training missions, all of which accounted for those 9 years of its pre-war service. After World War II began for America on December 7, 1941, the Indianapolis was immediately deployed to the Pacific Theater of Operations. It was there that it ended its service. The cruiser did not go to the Atlantic or other regions, but moved very actively across the Pacific Ocean, participating in major operations. The first significant operation for the Indianapolis was the attack on New Guinea. There, it provided support to 2 aircraft carriers, the Lexington and the Yorktown. It is worth noting that thanks to the element of surprise, the Americans managed to inflict significant losses on the Japanese. After this, the ship, as part of a convoy, departed for Australia. Another important event of 1942 was the operation to bombard the Aleutian Islands. Among them, Kiska Island is particularly well known. The Americans stormed this island when the Japanese were no longer there, and unfortunately suffered some losses. Even a destroyer was blown up by a mine laid by the Americans themselves, although the enemy had long since evacuated. The Indianapolis also participated in this operation, shelling the coast. It is worth noting that a significant portion of the tasks performed by the Indianapolis, like many other Allied ships during World War II, involved coastal bombardments. In 1943, the Indianapolis continued its participation in operations, including the capture of the Aleutian Islands. During that time, it intercepted and sank a Japanese vessel with a displacement of 3,100 tons. After the successful capture of these islands, the cruiser returned to Hawaii. There, it served as the flagship of Admiral Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, participating in the battles for Makin, for Tarawa, and also shelling the Marshall Islands. These operations were quite successful, as after the Battle of Midway, the Americans confidently advanced across the Pacific. The year 1944 was marked by some of the largest battles in the Pacific for the capture of various atolls. These included Kwajalein, Saipan, and the Mariana Islands. In the middle of the year, a grand battle erupted in the Philippine Sea, where the Japanese aircraft carriers Taiho and Shokaku were sunk, and nearly 450 Japanese planes were destroyed. Well, the cruiser Indianapolis undoubtedly took an active part in these events, opening fire and shooting down enemy planes. However, I must say these episodes were quite typical for that time, and there is little truly unusual to tell here. In contrast, the year 1945 was significantly more interesting for the Indianapolis. It supported attacks on Iwo Jima, covering the fleet, and, what is particularly interesting for us, the aircraft carriers when they first launched their planes for a strike on Tokyo. But again, most of these tasks were quite routine for a large warship. It carried out bombardments of coastal positions on Okinawa, as well as on the Ryukyu Islands. Typical operations performed by other ships of the fleet. By the way, it is worth noting that throughout its service, the Indianapolis received as many as 10 battle stars. This is indeed a very significant indicator for any ship. For example, during the intensive shelling of Okinawa, which began on March 24, 1945, the Indianapolis continuously engaged targets for 7 days. It was with such tasks that the ships of the fleet were then occupied. However, the most interesting and, unfortunately, the most tragic page in the history of the cruiser Indianapolis unfolded in the summer of 1945. Specifically, on July 16, 1945, when the Indianapolis departed from the shores of San Francisco carrying an absolutely secret cargo. This secret cargo was critically important: uranium, and some parts for the infamous Little Boy bomb, which was to be dropped on Hiroshima. The final destination for this stage was an airfield on Tinian Island, where the ship was scheduled to arrive on July 26th. Overall, everything went smoothly. The bomb components were successfully delivered. After this, the ship was to head to Leyte Gulf, which it did on July 28th. And this is where the most interesting part begins. The ship's commander at the time was Captain Charles McVay III. His fate was closely intertwined with this story. What was the issue? Generally, ships, especially large ones and compared to submarines not very maneuverable, were not supposed to travel without an escort. Throughout the entire war in the Pacific Ocean, no ship of this class had ever traveled independently. However, the USS Indianapolis became the first to proceed to Leyte Gulf unescorted. Even more surprising is that Captain McVay requested an escort, but he was denied. This was despite the fact that the responsible officer in Guam, from where the Indianapolis departed, knew that a destroyer had been sunk in the area the ship was to traverse just a few days earlier, and Japanese submarines were actively operating there. But despite all this, the Indianapolis set off without any escort. At 1:14 in the morning on July 30th, the Japanese submarine I-58 fired 6 torpedoes at the ship. 2 of them struck. The first tore off part of the bow, and the second hit somewhere in the center of the ship, causing an enormous explosion. It appeared the artillery magazines detonated. After this, the ship sank in just 12 minutes, taking with it at least 300 crew members out of 1,196. Thus, approximately 900 people found themselves in the water. The events preceding this also raised questions. Captain McVeigh was not informed that submarines were active in the area. Nevertheless, he still employed defensive maneuvers, the so-called zigzag, a zigzagging movement. But as soon as dusk fell, he canceled this order, and the ship proceeded straight. His argument was that zigzagging was ineffective at dusk and at night because it was impossible to fully control its proper execution. And the most terrifying thing, no one searched for the people. Although the ship sent a distress signal and it was received by 3 different stations, none of them understood the seriousness of the alarm. At one station, the commander was drunk. At another, they said, "Do not disturb." And at the third, the signal was received. But they decided it was a Japanese deception, as the Japanese sometimes did this. Only on August 2nd, quite by accident, a PV-1 Ventura reconnaissance aircraft on an anti-submarine mission in the area spotted an oil slick and then people in the water. Why by accident? Because it had antenna problems. A mechanic climbed onto the fuselage, opened some technical hatch, and accidentally looked through it down at the sea, and saw people there. If not for this incident, perhaps no one would have been found. After the information was relayed to the proper authorities, a Catalina flying boat immediately flew to the same area, and a destroyer was dispatched. When the Catalina arrived at the scene, it saw approximately 800 people in the water. Of course, by this point, there were fewer. It relayed additional instructions to the destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle, which was also nearby. The destroyer arrived and began pulling people from the water. The Catalina, despite being forbidden to land on the water, also touched down. Why? Because the area was teeming with sharks. It is emphasized everywhere that many people died from shark attacks during this time, and even landing on the water was dangerous. Approximately 320 people were rescued from the 900 who survived the disaster. Such a simultaneous loss would have been a severe blow to the reputation of the United States. Therefore, the sinking of the ship was announced only on the day of Japan's surrender to somewhat mitigate the situation. After all these events, investigations began to ascertain why this had happened. They led to Captain McVeigh being brought to trial. He was accused of 2 things. Firstly, that he did not give an order for immediate evacuation from the ship, and 300 people died because of it. Secondly, that he canceled the zigzag movement. The first accusation was dropped as the ship was completely de-energized after being hit by torpedoes, and an order could only be given verbally, which he in fact did. Regarding the zigzag, things were very interesting. The commander of submarine I-58, Mochitsura Hashimoto, who sank the Indianapolis, was brought to court. He stated that even if the ship had been moving in a zigzag pattern, it would not have saved it. In addition, another submarine veteran, an American one this time, also testified that zigzag movement would in no way have helped the ship survive if it was visible. And it was visible despite it being night. Despite the fact that Captain McVeigh was initially charged specifically on the second point, the accusation was later dropped by Admiral Chester Nimitz, who reinstated him to his post. McVeigh ended his service in 1949 already as an admiral, so for him, everything concluded relatively well. However, it can be said that the case was still suppressed. It remains unclear why the ship sailed without escort and why 3 stations ignored the distress signal. And most interestingly, the ship was supposed to arrive in port on Guam on July 30th. All arriving ships were marked on a special tactical map as having arrived. Yet the Indianapolis was removed from the tactical map and marked as having arrived, despite the fact that it was not actually there. And again, it is unclear why this was done, and no one checked whether the ship had truly returned. Overall, it was simply an incredible coincidence of circumstances and blatant negligence. The location of the ship's remains is now known. A film about the fate of the Indianapolis was recently released. Perhaps someone has seen it. Additionally, it was mentioned in several other films, at least 5, sometimes just appearing fleetingly. These, in general, are the matters associated with this ship. I hope this information was interesting to you. Until next time.